Welcome, and thank you all for coming. I'm Eileen Galulian. As acting director of the Harriman Center for the Humanities this year, I'm here to introduce our guest speakers for this evening's event. Sharon Marcus, to whom I'll turn over the proceedings in a moment, is the Orlando Harriman Professor of English and Comparative Literature here at Columbia University. She's also the author of the award-winning books Apartment Stories, City and Home in 19th Century Paris and London, which was published in 1999, and Between Women, Friendship, Desire, and Marriage in Victorian England, 2007. She's currently writing a book about theatrical celebrity in the 19th century. And with Stephen Best, she recently edited what has proved to be a bellwether issue of the journal Representations, a special issue entitled The Way We Read Now. The recipient of many prestigious fellowships and awards, including at Columbia a Jerry Lenfest Distinguished Faculty Award, Professor Marcus is also the fiction editor of the online journal Public Books, which is, I was told to tell you, is www.publicbooks.org. It's, quote, a curated monthly journal devoted to spirited debate about books and the arts. Eric Klinenberg is professor of sociology, public policy, and media culture and communications at New York University, and he's the editor of Public Culture, an interdisciplinary journal of transnational cultural studies, about which you can learn more if you go to www.publicculture.org. He's the author of many articles that have appeared in both scholarly and popular publications, including The New Yorker, recently, the New York Times Magazine, Rolling Stone, the London Review of Books, The Nation, the Washington Post, the Guardian, Slate, and the radio program This American Life. He's written 3 books to date. The first is the multi-award-winning Heat Wave, a social autopsy of disaster in Chicago, 2003, about the deadly heat wave of summer 1995, a theatrical adaptation of which premiered in Chicago in 2008. The second is Fighting for Air, The Battle to Control America's Media, 2007. And the third, which is just out in paperback and which we are discussing tonight, is Going Solo, The Extraordinary Rise and Surprising Appeal of Living Alone. Challenging the myths of increasing social isolation and community decline, Professor Klinenberg argues that the dramatic emergence of single living is made possible by the robustness of urban societies. He draws our attention to its benefits as well as its dangers. Sharon?
So I want to thank Eileen Galuli and Jonah Cardillo of the Harriman Center for the Humanities for helping put this together in their inimitably expert way, and Eric Klinenberg for being here tonight. And just to set the scene a little bit, this is a joint event sponsored by Public Books and by the Harriman Center for the Humanities. And Eric is the editor of Public Culture, and I'm the fiction editor of Public Books. We met a few years ago, and we found out we'd both done time at Brown and Berkeley before moving to New York City, and shared an interest in urban culture. And then we started talking more about our work, but this is actually the first time we've gotten to have a conversation like this.
Terrifying.
No, you'll be fine. So I thought I'd start by telling you a bit about some of the book's main ideas, and then we'll start grilling Eric about what they really mean. The book starts from the premise, well, Eric's a sociologist, so the book starts from the premise that social theory insists that we're communal creatures, that the nuclear family is the unit of social organization, but that in recent years people have actually been voting with their feet away from communal living, away from marriage, away from living with other people. And the numbers tell a tale that I still find surprising even after having absorbed them. Over 50% of Americans now live alone. 1 out of 7 Americans lives alone is what that translates into in another way.
About 50% are single.
About 50% are single, sorry. 1 out of 7 live alone. 17 million women, 14 million men, and most of them between the ages of 35 and 64. So it's interesting. It's interesting partly as an example of the difference between the normal and the normative, because I think normatively we still think, oh, people are in couples. More people than ever are in couples. Now, gay people are all forced to be in couples along with straight people. So coupledom seems to have become increasingly normative, but the actual statistical norm is suggesting otherwise. So one of the questions that Eric starts out asking is why? Why did this start happening? And he offers some explanations. The rise of the cult of the individual, So an increasing emphasis on the idea that authenticity comes from autonomy and self-realization, that we're most ourselves by ourselves. Feminism, which made more women ready, willing, and able to not be married and live alone. The rise of urbanism, which gives more people more opportunities to be with others even when living alone. And then longevity. People are living longer, so even those who were once living with others often outlive the people they were living with and then decide not to enter into another roommate situation of any kind late in life. And then the book takes us through the life cycle and starts with some observations even about children, that more and more children expect to have a room of their own. I'd actually be interested in a show of hands, how many of you got to have a room all to yourself as a child? Lucky devils. I didn't, okay, but I wanted one. Then people in their 20s, newly released from college roommates, if they're people who went to college, try to not live with roommates as soon as they can, but that living alone is something that you have to learn how to do because not everybody's actually trained to do it. Then people in their 30s and 40s who live alone have to resist the pressure to pair up, to be with someone. And then at various points in the life cycle, but certainly as one gets older, there are people who maybe were living with people before but aren't now and decide they like it that way. They don't want to go back to living with others. There's a great section on pets. So I guess one question we can ask is, are you truly living alone if you're living with one or more pets? And then there are comparative discussions, and that's one of the things that I want us to talk about more. You know, is this just an American phenomenon? But the question I wanted to start asking you to discuss is, your first book is really about people who died because they were isolated and living alone in the Chicago heat wave. And now you're writing a book about the challenges, but very much the pleasures and satisfactions of living alone. How did you get from dying alone to going solo?
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's really the question for the book, because when I started this project, it was very much a follow-up to Heatwave, and you know, for the overwhelming majority of people in this room and in the world whom I presume have never read or heard of Heatwave, the thing that was interesting about the story is that this is an event that took place in Chicago in 1995 for about 3 days of really hot temperature, and 700 some people died in a couple of days. And the book was kind of trying to understand why so many people died and also why this event was so forgettable, because it failed to register as a Sandy or a Katrina kind of thing, even though it was really deadly. And one of the big parts of the story is that hundreds of people died alone. And I think one of the reasons that the book hit a nerve when it came out is because it really told this story about the extent to which it was possible to grow isolated in an American city. And in fact, I grew very concerned about this issue of social isolation, which has been a long-standing concern of American sociologists in particular. And so the book kind of became part of this tradition of American social scientists who write about the problem of excessive individualism,
Bowling
or loneliness,
alone.
right? So from the lonely crowd to the pursuit of loneliness to habits of the heart and the fall of public man to bowling alone. And maybe some of you saw Shirley Turkle's book that came out last year, Alone Together or Together Alone, who knows. This is a theme. Like we are often told about how isolated we are. And the Chicago heat wave was really a disturbing event because it showed just how alone some people were. And so I then started doing work on a media book, but in my mind I was always thinking about this haunting problem. And at some point I had done a story for This American Life about what happens to people who die alone in Los Angeles. What happens to the body, what happens to their home, what happens to their goods, how do you track down next of kin? And I kind of got pulled into this macabre world, which is really fascinating. And I started doing research on a book that I thought was going to be called Alone in America. And it was going to be about this problem. And so if you stop and think about it for a moment, you realize how far going solo as a concept is from Alone in America. And the story is that I started doing research and doing everything I could to learn about this social change. And I never gave up the view that social isolation is a dangerous and scary thing, or that loneliness is serious and an issue. But they represent two parts of what is in fact a much larger and more sweeping phenomenon. And to call a book Alone in America would be to miss the complexity and the power of this change. And just one last thing, to put this into perspective, until the 1950s, you literally cannot find a single society in the history of our species that sustained large numbers of people living alone for long periods of time. We have always lived in groups. And in fact, when anthropologists and sociologists and historians had these big debates about whether the family was, is a universal, the debate was, which was a really contentious debate. The debate was always, is the nuclear family universal, or are there alternate ways of connecting and living together like a kibbutz? No one ever proposed the idea that people would live alone. It just didn't exist. And so what's so startling are the numbers that, in the United States today, in Manhattan where we are, 1 out of every 2 households is a one-person household. In New York City, there are more than 1 million people living alone. The cities that have more than 40% of their households with just one person include, Washington, D.C. and Seattle and Atlanta
Washington,
and Denver.
D.C. actually tops the list.
It does, right? It's number 1.
44% of people in Washington, D.C.
40. It's like 48. So it's staggering and sweeping, and it's just bigger than dying alone. That was just inadequate. So one of the big turning points for me in the process of writing this and researching it was recognizing that the idea that I thought I was writing about was wrong.
So talk a little bit about your research process, because there are a lot of people here who do research. The book has lots of numbers, statistics, talks about big patterns over long stretches of time, shorter term changes, but then there's a lot of ethnographic case studies almost. So what was your research process, and also what most surprised you in the research itself?
So, this is a book that I wound up working on for about 7 years. And I worked with a whole team of graduate students from NYU and from UC Berkeley, and one was at UT Austin. It was a really kind of amazing group. And I hired graduate, PhD students to help me do interviews. And we started talking to people who lived alone at different ages and in different kinds of places. So we realized kind of up front that it means something different to live alone as a young adult than it does to live alone as a middle-aged adult, that it means something different to be older. Living alone is expensive, it's a luxury, so it's far more common among more affluent people. You don't find people living alone in poor neighborhoods or in poor nations, but there are these clusters of very poor men who live alone today, and these kind of the remnants of the Bowery district and places like this, the hotel residences. So I had a special concern about them from the work I did in Chicago, so we did a lot of research there. That I would say is the kind of the primary material of the book. We did more than 300 interviews, all of which were transcribed, and we have this massive archive of people living alone. And then, I'm primarily a kind of an ethnographer and an interviewer, but I also do think the numbers are important, so I looked at the census data over time and looked at survey research. I worked with somebody who helped me look at, analyze the General Social Survey, which is kind of the best data we have on the behavior of Americans living in different ways. And so I was able to make a bunch of claims about, how people who live alone act compared to people who are married, for instance. I read some history, some anthropology, a little bit of literature, but I hesitate to say that with you sitting next to me here at this fine humanities center. But I tried to be really comprehensive, and that turned out to be a great thing, because you asked what the big surprise was. I mean, for me, the book was really full of revelations. I really did expect that I was going to write a story about how disconnected American society had become, about the risks of being alone and living alone. And I thought this would be kind of a social problems book. And the conclusions I reached in the end were very different. And to kind of summarize it, and I know we'll get back to the details, I wound up believing in the end that people live alone precisely because we're so connected, we're so interconnected. In other words, it's our interdependence that makes our independence possible. And that really is a counterintuitive idea. And I have by no means earned it with you tonight. So let me see if we can go back and get to it.
Actually, one of the things I want to ask is, would you also turn that around and say people need independence in order for interdependence to be tolerable? I mean, from a psychological perspective, I think there are a lot of theories that say that good relationships depend on people giving each other space, to use that kind of horrible language for a second, but also that in terms of development, children develop a sense of autonomy from having a security in their caretaker, but they also need a sense of autonomy in order to be tolerating of their family ties and all the demands that they make. So did you find that borne out?
Very, very much so. I mean, I think one of the concerns of our time is really not that we're isolated so much as that we're overconnected, right? That we are so hooked into digital culture and our social media, and this is true especially for young people, but I think, I am not innocent, and raise your hand if you are. It's really a problem of our time.
I'm happy I'm at this event so I don't have to check my email for an hour.
Right, I mean, it's very hard to live with all this kind of potential to be engaged in social life and communication. So I think that one of the appeals of living alone is that it affords people a capacity to have some solitude that can be restorative, but can also give them a chance to develop. And I think this is especially important for young people. The idea that, which was very common in the interviews we did with younger adults under the age of 35, that it was only really by living alone that a person could grow up and become adult and develop the capacity to take care of oneself. It was a really interesting notion, I think, and one that I think is kind of historically unique. And the claim is something like, now that we live in a moment where the average age of first marriage is higher than it's ever been before. In New York City, the average age of first marriage is over 30. And for highly educated, successful young people, this is going to be a hard thing to say given this economic moment, but it's still true. The capacity to afford a home of one's own is greater than it's been before also. And we could talk about that because I know it's a recession and it doesn't feel that way. There are we now have this kind of, we'd have this stage of life that's not so uncommon in cities, in major cities, where people between the ages of, say, 23, 24, and 35, 36, 37, 38, 40, 45 are living by themselves. Not just for a year or two often, but sometimes for long stretches of time. And they insisted that this was really the way they could become an adult. It's not you don't become an adult by getting married. You don't become an adult by having children. You become an adult by getting a place of your own. And I think part of that is this notion that you can develop, take risks, experiment with different kinds of relationships, think about who you are, who you want to be, what you want from a partner. And in fact, we know that people who marry under the age of 25 are far more likely to get divorced than people who marry over that age.
So let's talk about economics, because we're in a recession that hasn't really ended, and I keep hearing about people after college moving back in with their parents. I hear about that from the people graduating from college, and I hear about it from the parents. Is that disrupting this trend? Do you see that as a blip? Do you see that as actually possibly a change?
So it is disrupting the trend, but only in a very narrow way. So to put this in perspective, there are significantly more people living alone in the United States in 2013 than there were in 2008 before the recession started. There are now more than 33 million people living alone. I think we updated the numbers in the paperback because the number of Americans living alone has gone up.
So where are they living? In storage units?
Well, I mean, there is an interesting phenomenon in,
I know, phone booths,
exactly.
because there's nothing else to do with them anymore.
They knocked them all down in my neighborhood. There has, however, been a fairly modest dip in the proportion of younger adults who are living alone. But it's much more modest than I expected. the percentage of adults under the age of 30 who are living alone in 2007 was 12. 12% of young adults lived alone. To put that in perspective, in 1950, 1% of adults under the age of 30 lived alone. This is really not something one did. Today, it's about 11%. And the numbers I'm seeing recently suggest that as the economy has started to turn around, those numbers are going up again. So, the New York Times had a story the other day about the huge demand for small, one-bedroom apartments and studios in cities across the country as younger people start to get money back. So that would be a surprise, except for as I was reading for the research in this book, I learned that in Japan during the lost decade, the number of people living alone actually also went up. And the reason is that when an economy is really bad, people become much more reluctant to make commitments to a spouse. Marriage rates go down. It's not the time to say we're going to take care of each other, surprisingly. And as you would imagine, very tough economic times are brutal on marriages. And so a lot of people actually do divorce. It's expensive because it means maintaining two households, but people do it. And that's, you kind of talked about this cult of the individual. I think that's one of the big things that for me was so powerful. Again, a surprise is no one really idealizes, or very few people idealize living alone. It's not as if you talk to people about living alone and they say, all I want in life is a place of my own that I can stay in forever.
My mother used to say that when she was mad at us.
Come to think of it, my wife does say that sometimes. But what people say is that, kind of realistically in their life, having a place of their own or being single beats the other option. But, people are not willing to stay in a relationship that feels bad for the sake of being in a relationship, even if it's going to cost them a lot of money. And they're willing to spend a really significant part of their income on an apartment if it affords them this domestic autonomy and independence. And I hadn't quite reckoned with the extent of those feelings. But I have to say, one of the most powerful things that I heard in my interviews with people who had been married or living with a partner and then separated and lived alone is that they would say, it's true that often I feel lonely, or occasionally I feel lonely living alone, but there's nothing more lonely than living with the wrong person. There's nothing more lonely than being in a bad relationship. Like, it's one thing to, and the psychology on this is actually pretty interesting. There's this great psychologist at University of Chicago, John Cacioppo, who writes about the physiology of loneliness, in which he says that the feeling of loneliness can be interpreted as our body's signal to us that we need companionship and we should get off the couch and get out into the world, and that a certain amount of loneliness can be a productive physiological response to a bad situation. But if you feel profoundly lonely and you're lying in bed at night next to your spouse and you feel that in a recurring way, that's a really difficult problem. And it's one that I think almost everyone can relate to, because most people here have been in relationships that ended, at some point or another.
So let's switch gears and talk about a more global perspective, because one common reaction I'm sure people have is, well, isn't this a US phenomenon? But one of the striking things about the book was that the countries I idealize as oases of communal, collective ethos, the Scandinavian countries, actually have a very high proportion of people living alone. But they sort of bear out your thesis that strong connections between people at all levels of the society can strengthen the ability to live alone. But they also seem to increase the desire to live alone. I mean, would you say it's a causal connection? Which direction is the cause moving in? And just tell us more about Sweden. I can never hear enough about Sweden.
Yeah, I mean, this is a complicated one because I like to parody the social science books that end with a conclusion, that basically proclaims Sweden the great model, and, as if we're going to do that here. And then I did it myself. So, don't throw stones, right? I said a little bit about how wrong I was and how much I learned in the process of doing this book, and the provisional title was Alone in America, and the alone part I realized was really wrong because it emphasized the loneliness, and also because it gave you the impression that people who live alone are actually more isolated, less connected. In fact, one of the findings in the book is that people who live alone are actually far more likely to spend time with friends and neighbors than people who are married, and they're even more likely to volunteer in civic organizations, which I really did not expect. So I clearly screwed up the alone part, but I was even more colossally wrong about the in America thing. And let me tell you how much I embarrassed myself, at previous, presentations of this concept, like when it was an embryonic, book project. And thank God for the graciousness and emotional and intellectual generosity of academic colleagues who, let me get away with this, or maybe thank God for the ignorance if they didn't know this. But I would give these presentations like trying to fit in with the Sharon Marcuses of the world, in which I'd have, images of Emerson and Thoreau and the Lone Ranger, and I'd talk about the American culture of the, rugged individual and self-reliance and all this stuff. And I really thought deep in my heart that this was an American phenomenon. I mean, what could be more American than such hyper-excessive individualism as we have in a city where half of the households are one-person households, right? I mean,
well, and in fact, Robert Ferguson has just written a book about this, so it is a strong American myth.
For sure, it's a very powerful idea, and so I could be forgiven for buying it.
Yeah, we forgive you.
But the data don't bear it out. So I haven't read Ferguson's book. I've just heard about it, and I'm curious to see how he treats this matter, because it turns out that the United States is a laggard, not a leader when it comes to living alone. Living alone is far more common in the Scandinavian countries, Sweden, Finland, Denmark, Norway. They're all around 40% one-person households at the national level. Sweden is 47%. Stockholm is upwards of 60%. So 6 out of every 10 households are one-person households, which is staggering. Living alone is more common in Canada than in the US. It's more common in Italy. It's more common in family-centric Japan than it is in the United States.
So people aren't huddling together for warmth.
Right.
But,
right. So this is like really staggering to me. So I try to think about well, what is it? And some people say, oh, maybe it's a religion. What's driving it? And I never did the careful enough research to figure out what's the variable that's driving this. But it does appear to me that living alone is more common in places that make greater investments in the collective good in public life. So, what's distinctive about the Scandinavian countries, and also what's distinctive about New York City, is the extent to which it invests in public goods. So public housing, social services, public transportation, public space, public spaces that really work well. Clearly, there's an architectural component. If you build housing stock, as Sweden had this famous Million program where they built 1 million units of subsidized housing. New York City has an unusually large number of relatively small apartments. When you do this, you give people the capacity to live alone, but also to be connected, to be alone together in a city. And of course, if I tell you that half of the households in Manhattan are one-person households, you know that they're not randomly distributed throughout Manhattan. There's certain neighborhoods where it's like 60 or 70%. And that's true for a lot of cities. So, this is a very, cosmopolitan room, I'm guessing. And if I say, the words Boston or Chicago or San Francisco or Seattle or Los Angeles or Paris or Berlin or London, or Sydney, I bet you're now thinking of the neighborhoods in those cities that have massive clusters of people who are living alone. And the other thing is that they're probably the places that are the most fun. And this, I think, was another thing that I didn't quite understand before I wrote the book, which is that there are some really, there are real problems with living alone, which we could talk about, but one of the things I've become convinced of is it's become a major force for the reanimation of urban life. Why has public culture and street life become so exuberant over the last several decades? Why are cafes and bars and restaurants a big part of the economy? But partly it's because there are all these people who are living alone and they don't want to be in their apartments and they go out more, right? So we know that they're more likely to spend time and money in bars and cafes and restaurants and things like that. So these places around the world that have high levels of living alone, whether it's Tokyo or Paris or Washington, D.C., also really have this kind of booming public life.
But it still sounds like very much a first world phenomenon. I mean,
Absolutely.
So how do you account for that?
Well, it's really expensive to live alone. I mean, it is a luxury to live alone. And I actually try to, so I mean, that when I understood that, it allowed me to kind of spin around this problem, which is that the conventional framing of this issue is, what's wrong with us? Why have we grown so isolated? Why have we lost our communities? The kind of bowling alone story. Because I do think there's this lament that we oftentimes fall into as social analysts, or we say, once upon a time there was a world which there were stronger families and better communities, and children were playing on the streets, and we all did everything together, and no one felt lonely, and it was a happier moment. And of course, like, if you get your sociology from Mad Men instead of Father Knows Best, that is kind of a myth. Or if you read, that Stephanie Kuntz, the great historian of marriage, has these amazing diaries from married women who are unhappy in their situation. You can read a lot about loneliness and alienation in families, but I think we romanticize that time. I'm pretty skeptical about that view I really do think Mad Men is better sociology than Father Knows Best. But the way the question got spun for me is to ask, why is it that of all the ways that people in the most affluent societies in the world could use our unprecedented resources, why is it that we're using them to get places of our own? And I actually think that's a really deep and difficult question. Interestingly, the three nations that have the fastest rates of living alone increasing in the world today are Brazil, China, and India. So where you see economic growth,
index of development.
In many ways it is. And I can't tell you how many calls I get from reporters in Latin America in particular who are just really intrigued by this because they're starting to see it in big Latin American cities, but they also have shantytown poverty not far away. But this is, and let me be clear, because I think some people feel like I'm not dealing with all the class complications here. This is primarily a story about the way that middle class and affluent people in prosperous nations are changing their lives. But I think the implications of it are pretty profound. And the reason I made this point about the neighborhoods that have big concentrations of one-person households also being places that you want to go and spend time in, no matter whether you're single or married, is because there are these kind of residual impacts that that the rise of living alone has had on cities more generally and on economies more generally, that are pretty interesting. They do make cities that have a lot of people living alone also, I think, tend to have pretty active public spheres, which work well for people no matter how they're living.
So I wanted to ask you a very different kind of question about impact. You recently had an article in the New Yorker about how New York City can try to adapt to climate change,
right?
The importance of social infrastructure in doing that, but some plans that might actually be really helpful. What's the environmental impact of living alone? On the face of it, my off-the-cuff answer would be it's a disaster. When you read Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique, she talks about how the feminine mystique was actually, in no small part, a plot to sell gadgets. And when I did some research on the rise of single living in the 60s, it turned out that was also a plot to sell gadgets. And so when you have lots of people living alone, you have more people using electricity, more literally, just more people using resurces. Is that the case? Because the numbers are very big. So it seems like they actually could have an impact. So
let me confess that, card-carrying member of the American Sociology Association that I am, when the project started, I was really down with this kind of line. This is about producing more consumers and, creating demand, basically. So like capitalism's dream would be to have a world full of individuated consumers, each of us with our own device, consuming our own media, our own products.
Turns out we do that when we live with people.
Well, that is true, and that's part of the story, and I do write, quite a lot about the extent to which we have individuated ourselves in homes. So one of my favorite things I learned writing this book was the stuff about the rising size of the average household, both in the United States and also in Europe, and the history of the crib. Not just the history of the private room, but the crib is a pretty modern invention. it's a really weird idea still that, you'd have a baby and you'd put the baby in this separate bed in a separate room, and, Dr. Spock, whom I wrote about a little bit, really moralizes about this. Like, if you have a child and it's an infant and you don't feel comfortable putting it in his or her own room, there's something wrong with you, kind parent, and you need to see a shrink. I mean, it's a really moralistic thing about, like, the way for a child to individuate is to have that separate space. So that's a whole thing in and of itself. And I write about the scene at the dinner table that we've all been part of, where everybody's kind of got their device and they're in their own world. But I think that when you look at the evidence on this, you just can't tell a plausible story that this is a capitalist plot. I mean, partly it's the story that the more socialist countries are the ones that have by far the highest rates of living alone. It's precisely their contributions to public programs and to social welfare that makes it possible for people to feel like they can live alone and still have the kinds of social protections and safety net that allows them to do this. If the United States were the leader in living alone, I would think, like, yeah, that's, but because we're so far behind, I'm cynical about it. Now, but the real question here is about the environmental impact. And, obviously, this is something I've been concerned about for a long time, from the heat wave book in Chicago to the stuff I'm doing now, which is really writing about cities and climate change and sustainability. And the honest answer to your question is that we just don't know. There's literally no good research on the question of whether living alone is bad for the environment and unsustainable. There's one research paper done by a British scholar that has gotten some attention that says it's a disaster, but the comparisons are really weak, actually. It's really bad science. And so part of the story here is that you have to get your comparisons right. And probably many of you have read this, the Green Manhattan thesis, that there's no greener place in the world, or in the United States at least, than Manhattan. And cities are much more ecologically sustainable than suburbs. So people who live in cities tend to have a much smaller carbon footprint. If you live in Manhattan, you live in a smaller apartment, you're likely to take public transportation or to walk. You consume less energy for heating and air conditioning in your home than you would if you were in a larger place, because high-rise buildings that have lots of units they spread the heat or the cooling from one place to the next. It's a pretty powerful argument. David Owen wrote this article called Green Manhattan in the New Yorker, and then it became a book as well. And for me, it's still an open question. Are 4 people who are living alone in Manhattan or Washington, D.C. and Seattle in relatively compact apartments, more likely, and I'll just kind of I'll speculate, they're more likely to use public transportation. Are they emitting more greenhouse gases than a family of 4 that lives in Chappaqua in a 4,000 square foot house with 2 SUVs and commutes all over the place? I'm skeptical that they are, and that might not be a fair comparison either. But I think everybody I know who is thinking about sustainability is convinced that the sustainable future is one in which we live densely, where we live in cities, where we rely more on public transit and walking, and less. We have less to do with big private homes and less to do with individual automobiles, and people who live alone just live in a more sustainable way. So it's an open question.
So I have a bunch more things I want to ask you, but I'm gonna give you an array.
Yeah.
You can pick one, and then I think we should open things up.
Deal.
Okay, so one of the things I would want to ask is suburbs versus cities. Is this still primarily an urban phenomenon, and if so, are people starting to build for it? So that's an architecture question. Then there's a question about social movements. Could you talk more about how feminism, maybe even gay liberation, helped produce a shift in attitudes about living alone? I promised my students from last semester who were in my Victorian novel class that I would ask a literature question. So the literature question would be something like, 19th century novels kind of anticipate your thesis about individuality and connection going hand in hand, because the 19th century novel depends on individual characters, and in a certain sense, not only is a symptom of the cult of the individual, but probably helped to found the cult of the individual. But in a novel, characters are never alone. They have to be interacting with other people. And it's hard to think of too many 19th century novels that really have characters living alone. But when you do think of characters living alone, it's not exactly going solo territory. So you have Raskolnikov, you have Dostoevsky's Underground Man. These are all kind of prefigurations of, Robert De Niro in Taxi Driver, like this crazed person who lives alone because he can't live with other people, and living alone makes him crazy.
Right.
Dickens has some people living alone. They tend to be abandoned children who are weirdly like adults and
Yeah.
kind of cute but kind of creepy.
Yeah.
So maybe it's just an issue about literary forms and that it's hard to represent living alone. There's
Yeah.
something not dramatic about living
Yeah.
alone. But
So I would have to be such an idiot to answer that question to you in this room. So why don't I do it? I guess I would say think about the more contemporary representations of people living alone, which in some ways kind of precede, well, they certainly precede the social science and journalism on this question. So there's Bridget Jones, there's obviously the Sex and the City women, there's the Mindy Kaling character in this new television series, there's Tina Fey in 30 Rock. So the woman, the kind of figure, I'm going to try to answer this in the feminism question and
right.
queer history thing together. Because
Virtual
clearly,
architecture,
well,
all right.
and then we're really going somewhere. Clearly a big driver of this story is, and you said this at the outset, is the rising status of women. Because when women gain control of their own lives and their own bodies, and when women gain access to the paid labor market en masse, this really changes the whole story of how we settle down. The age of first marriage starts to go up, the divorce rate skyrockets. It becomes possible, we see Helen Gurley Brown with this incredible Sex and the Single Girl story, which is really kind of a manifesto for why you, as a young single woman, need to have your own place. And it's amazing. She says, you need to have a place of your own. I don't mean like a room in a sorority house. Like, you need to get your own apartment, even if it's over a garage. And it's like 1961, 1962. And you start to see this figure of women who are staying single and really establishing the notion that their autonomy, their adulthood rests on their capacity to be independent in this way. And it's actually quite fascinating. So today, here's architecture. God, I love it. Women are more likely than men to live alone, but that's almost entirely because women outlive men. So under the age of 50, men are actually more likely to live alone than women. And we know that men are more like, men and women, same levels of education. There's an inequality in terms of income. Men make more money on average. Given that, isn't it shocking that women are 2 times more likely than men to buy places when they're single? Women are twice more likely than men to buy a home of their own when they're single. And there's no economic argument for that. Like, the economist wouldn't know what to do with that. But the story is that you talk to single women, and basically what they say is, look, I'm not going to wait for a partner to establish my own life and to be an adult. Like, this is who I am, this is my life, and I'm going to buy a place, and it has this incredibly powerful symbolic significance to them. And so we see the Ally McBeal kinds of characters that have these things. Now they might be pining away for partners, right? And this is really a tension in the Sex and the City story, which is that on the one hand, we're supposed to love the independence of these women and the glamour of their lives, and the other hand, especially in the movies, they're really all about the search for the man. They get reduced to, even the one who's really not searching for the man is ultimately going to search for the man. It's a real ideological disappointment if you've got a commitment to this view that, that marriage is not the only happy way to live. But getting a place of their own becomes symbolically significant, whereas for men, that's like the last thing in the world that you'd want to do, because part of your singledom and your bachelorism is that you can be flexible and do what you want to do and make commitments when you need to, but only when you really need to. And so buying a place is wrapped up with this other bill of goods that has to do with kind of settling down. So men are really reluctant to buy homes until they're married. And I was startled to discover that. So I guess the representations are changing over time. Clearly there's still the psychopathic killers who are more likely to be estranged from society and alone. And I guess I should say at this point, my book is really not like the case to live alone. My goal is not that you leave the room tonight and go home to your partner and say, honey, I saw the best talk tonight, and I have this great idea. It would be hypocritical of me to do that. I'm married, I have 2 young children. I did live alone for some part of my life, but not for a long, long time. And I'm not really trying to say, this is a better way to live. But I do think that, at a moment when, well, first of all, I think that we've really misunderstood this phenomenon. I think we've failed to recognize it, period. I've said this, I think, is the biggest social change of the last 50 or 60 years, that we have failed to name or identify. Tied to your social movements thing, too, because most people who are single or living alone don't necessarily embrace that as their identity. They don't self-define that way. In fact, they might be eager to define as part of a couple as soon as they can find the right person, even if they stay that way for 20 years. They don't see themselves politically in those terms. They'll see themselves politically as an environmentalist or a woman or African American or pro-choice, but not as single.
But there are activists. There are singles.
There are, and I write about the kind of fledgling movement, and clearly, like, the political parties are now chasing this demographic, right? Like, if you were conscious during the 2012 election, you had to note that the Democrats were doing everything possible to get single women.
Not to
Well, there are lots of reasons not to have been conscious during that year, but clearly, the chase is on. The businesses are now chasing singles because they realize this is a $1 trillion, $2 trillion market. A lot of single people and a lot of people living alone, and they need smaller appliances. They want individual espressos. Think about those Nespresso makers and who they're going after. They want single serving items at the grocery store. Think about the Whole Foods bar that allows you to have a hot dinner when you come home, or the compact car. There's a whole set of if you think about it, there's a whole set of consumer goods that they're now developing for this. So I think all of that's happening. So I think it's a massive social change, and I think its consequences are underappreciated. I think we've been quick to conflate living alone with feeling lonely or being isolated, and that's a mistake. But I also think, and this will be the last thing I say before we open it up, at a moment when we have come to appreciate the many different ways in which people could organize their lives, living with partners of all varieties, different kinds of relationships, mixed marriages, gay marriages, cohabitation. We are culturally open to a lot of different ways of organizing the life that we were not open to before. It's really striking to me that this has been the thing that's been the most difficult to get over and to deal with, because it's so prevalent. Right? I mean, who in this room does not have someone in their life, a family member, a close friend, a child, who knows, someone who lives alone, and you think about them and you worry about whether they're going to be okay. And it's so funny. People in the interviews kept talking to me about what a Rorschach test they become as individuals. Like, they walk into a room and people just project their own feelings onto them, right? So, like, there's clearly someone in every family who comes to you immediately at Thanksgiving and wants to know, like, are you dating someone? Can I fix you up with somebody? What can I do? Like, as if, like, the only problem in your life is the problem that you're single, and as if the thing that you're worrying about all the time whenever you walk into a room is, am I going to find the right person here? And that might be true. There might be, you might be really actively interested in finding a partner, but that's probably not what you're reducible to. And so, one of my heroes in sociology is Irving Goffman, and he had this idea about spoiled identity, stigma. This great little book called Stigma, which is about what happens when your identity gets spoiled. And the concept of spoiled identity is that when someone sees you or meets you, like, you are reduced to that thing, right? So, like, African American or gay, or like that's how you become. And I think a lot of single people feel that their identity has gotten spoiled in the context of their friends and family members, or certain ones. But really, it's much more about the person who's trying to fix them up than it is about that person. So one thing I really want the book to do is to humanize this situation and to get us to be a little more reflective about what it means, because this is not a really exotic thing. This is as mainstream as apple pie.
Okay, so it sounds to me, I haven't yet read the book, but it sounds to me as if it kind of identifies broadly two categories. So the people who live alone, and that would correlate significantly with people who are single, and then the people who live with other people with whom they're in some kind of romantic relationship or maybe a familial relationship. So I found myself thinking about a sort of middle group in which you might have people living with others with whom they don't necessarily have a kind of strong emotional bond. So you have to coexist in a space, but you don't have the sort of emotional benefits or costs of having that kind of interpersonal connection. So I'm just wondering if you encountered that a lot in your interviews, and if so, did it lead you towards any kind of interesting insights about that group? I'm sure it's mostly people under 35.
Well, so yes and no. It's a totally fair question. I mean, everybody we interviewed had lived with other people at some point, and there are clearly lots of young people who are living alone after living with roommates. Now, mind you, we have a sampling problem here. You sound like a social scientist, so I'm going to just talk in that way for a second. The problem is that everybody we interviewed was living alone, so they had exited from the situation. They're opting into the situation. And by the way, people say, like, well, how many people are living alone by choice versus, they have to? And my kind of polemical answer is everybody who lives alone is living alone by choice. Which isn't to say that, the 82-year-old woman whose husband has just died is choosing to have been a widow. That would be cruel. But 100 years ago, older people who lost their spouse would move back in with their children. And today, there are all kinds of living arrangements for people who have lost a spouse. And oftentimes, they're cheaper than the living arrangement of keeping your place of your own. This is especially true for people who are younger or people who are divorced. There are all kinds of ways in which you can get roommates or move in with family that we used to just do as a matter of course. There was no other choice. So I've got all these people who are living alone and they're paying a premium to do so because they have to. So I'm asking them. But when you ask them about having roommates, they will tell you, look, having roommates is a really great thing until it isn't. And so the kind of modal story for the young people are, you graduate from Columbia and, you move downtown, someplace exotic. And, like the East Village or Chinatown. And you live with a bunch of people. And it's fun at first, you kind of carry college culture with you. You go out in packs. It's very social, it's like the girls phenomenon. And then, like, you start to have these problems, right? Exactly. You start to have these problems, and
here has been watching Girls.
This paragraph, right? There's like a paragraph or two when I tried to list all the problems with roommates that people gave me. They're really funny. The stories you get about the things that roommates do are really wild. So I'll make you. If you have to read the book to get them, but they're really pretty funny. And so there's some point at which, like, you just don't want to have those roommates around anymore precisely because you're not bound to them. And in fact, like, you are willing to pay a shockingly high proportion of your income to get a place of your own. And you will live in a neighborhood that's not as good as the neighborhood where you had roommates, in a smaller place with a crappy landlord who's exploiting you, just so you can have this, like, freedom. And the freedom is going to afford you all kinds of things. Like, people talked a lot about sexual independence and anonymity, not having to have someone there to, like, notice who came home with them the night before, or to be there on the couch when you bring someone home, or to be playing music when you're trying to sleep, et cetera. There are a whole bunch of advantages that people felt for that. So there's also a world of people who are cohabiting, I always get questions about co-housing, and there's no doubt that there are a lot of people who are finding new arrangements. I mean, romantic cohabitation in particular is a very popular thing, but it seems to me like what you're asking about are kind of non-romantic, kind of cohabiting roommate situations, and I don't think that they're all that compelling for most people. I think there's some people who want to do them, but it's a relatively fringe phenomenon. In fact, during the time around the time the book came out, one of the big co-housing places in Brooklyn that everybody was telling me I had to go and write about that, like, it fell apart. They're unstable.
There's an exhibit at the Museum of the City of New York right now about the architecture of living alone, and they have a lot of statistics, and in all 5 boroughs of New York, only 6% of households are unrelated adults living together, like roommate situations or some kind, what you were asking about, which is a surprisingly small number,
Yeah.
but not to you.
Well, it has many appeals, and I think it has appeals at certain moments of people's lives. But a lot of middle-aged people we talked to who had separated or gotten divorced said, getting a place of their, like they're actually under real financial pressure, and it's tough to be divorced or separated and to suddenly have to take care of things on your own. I'm not glib about this, and so you would think like those are natural people to get their own, to get roommates. But actually, for them, they often reported like getting a place of their own was precisely what allowed them to kind of get back on their feet and regain their own strength and figure out what they wanted. And the last thing in the world they wanted is to move in with some random person.
So, amongst the different people that you interviewed, and you mentioned there's different age groups, there's different patterns. Did their perceptions of living alone change? So were younger people happier about living alone than older people who are reaching that age of infirmity, or was it consistent throughout?
Yeah. Could you all hear in the back? No, yeah. The question is, were there differences in age? Were young people happier living alone than older people? Did you see any patterns? I've never been a fan of like the happiness research industry. How happy are you right now on a scale of 1 to 5? Are you somewhat happy? Are you very happy? Somewhat unhappy? So I wasn't like measuring happiness. I can only interpret based on the things that people, the tone of the interview. Look, clearly a lot of young people who get places of their own are on this, progression towards some other situation. They see themselves as like being part of a developmental stage, like this is where I become an adult and establish my independence, and I'm likely to go find a partner and get married. And I should be clear about this, the overwhelming majority of Americans get married at some point. Like more than 90% of Americans get married, so you're really likely to get married at some point in life. And it's going down a little bit, so don't feel bad if it doesn't happen to you. But most people do get married. So younger people, of course, like they've just left roommates or they've escaped their parents' basement, and there's kind of a heroic, achievement of doing it. But it doesn't come without challenges. So for instance, a lot of interviews with young people who got a place of their own, and there's one interview that's really memorable to me. It's in the book. It's a woman who says, I got my place and I kind of thought it was going to be like college. I kept waiting for the phone to ring or for someone to come and knock on the door, and it didn't happen. That's not what happens when you get your own place in Williamsburg. So you have to learn the skill of putting yourself out into the world. And I think Sharon said this, that it's not as if any of us has an education in how to live alone. We don't have role models. Like we all grow up with other people around us. So we have to fit in, you don't get a guidebook for doing it. And no one ever talked about it. So what the hell do you do? It's like you get into your hotel room and then, hey, there's no one around, so you turn the TV on. But it's really destructive to just turn the TV on, and people start to do that. So you have to learn this whole set of skills, and that's challenging. So there's often like a time when people get their own place where they have real work to do. I talked to a lot of middle-aged women who I think were at first really devastated about the demise of their relationship if they had come out of one, who realized over time that they were better off than they thought they were going to be. Some women said, this is the happiest I've ever been, because they had built up these networks of other single women, and the world today is full of networks of women in cities who are single, who support each other in pretty remarkable ways. And I should say that there are some pretty clear gendered dynamics around living alone. Men are much more likely to get isolated than women. Women do a much better job making and maintaining relationships throughout the life course. And so women tend to be more socially connected. And again, I don't want to be glib about it. I think they were generally express this view that they would be open to having the right relationship, but they were not going to race into a relationship just for the sake of it, because they had figured out that they could be pretty happy, without a guy. And I don't know if any of you saw this. There's a journalist named Lori Gottlieb who wrote a book a few years ago called "Marry Him: The Case for Settling," And it was one of these Atlantic monthly,
Flashes in the pan.
well, one of these magazine ideas, which is like based on something that has no basis in truth in any point, but it's like reported as a trend. And this was really like the case to marry him, written by a journalist who was single, who was not making that, was not doing that person, not making that choice to settle. And I think no one else did either, because people don't want that. It can be really lonely and alienating and depressing to be with a person you don't want to be with. So people don't make that choice, and so that was interesting. Then, I thought, especially because of the heat wave stuff, where there were a lot of older people dying alone, that the group that would most be kind of lonely and depressed and seeking out more companionship were older people. And in some ways this is true. I mean, here I want to underscore that there are a lot of older people in New York City and cities around the world who do suffer from loneliness and isolation, who don't have the kind of social contact they need. If they get sick, it can be a really disastrous situation. If they're debilitated in some way, it can be really tough. If they don't have the skills to get themselves out and connected in the world, it can be isolating. It's a serious, serious thing that deserves more attention, and it will grow more serious as more and more people grow old and we fail to find good solutions for housing people in ways that will facilitate connections. But I had this idea that you walk into like a senior center and it's like you find all these older women who are like knocking each other over to find the last remaining single guys and like get them to the to get married to the altar before it's too late. There's a stereotype out there. I didn't really have that idea, but there's this image out there of like all these women who are beating each other up to get the last remaining guys in the geriatric center, and nothing could be further from the truth. And there's a great line that someone gave me. These women they're much more interested in having someone to go out with than having someone to come home to. Because if you think about it, older women who live alone have typically outlived their spouse, which means that they have cared for the spouse as they got sick and died. And we know from the health literature that itself is a really dangerous experience. If you are a caretaker for a spouse who's really sick and dying, you have a much higher chance of getting sick and dying yourself during that period of time and immediately after. Like the last thing the 77-year-old women in Brooklyn we interviewed wants was to like go out and find another guy who was probably not going to be 48, right? Right? Like she does not want to meet the eligible bachelor who's 86 to go through that experience again. So it was interesting. Like for the older people, happiness was the wrong concept here, but there was an understanding of living alone that is more sophisticated than we commonly understand. And I have to say this kind of, I'm a social scientist, but very committed to a kind of humanistic form of social science that really tries to understand what it means to live and the deep and serious human problems that we all confront, and to take seriously the intelligence of the people I talk to as they go through these situations. And I think there is a kind of brand of social science in which, and this is kind of my problem with the lament about how terrible things are. Like people kind of complain about how bad things are for other people and how disconnected we've grown and how we all need community and we should bowl together in leagues more often and things like that. But nobody wants to do that stuff.
Well, if you live in New York, you can't go bowling. It'll cost you
it's too expensive.
$300 to bowl for an hour.
So like one of the things that I really loved about this project was the chance to talk to really intelligent people at different stages of their life about the way that they were trying to take care of themselves and make life work. And if you have the idea that if you just get married, everything is going to be fine, so you should race into it because this is going to be the solution, like you are not paying attention. Right? Like you probably weren't paying attention at home when you were growing up, or you certainly weren't paying attention to your like the families around you. And look, so I'm a child of the divorce revolution, and probably most of you or many of you in the room are either part of it or you're either part of the divorce revolution or a child of it at this point. Like we have seen unhappy families, and so when families work, they work really, really well. You know, a domestic family, a nuclear family that works well is a brilliant social formation that provides all kinds of support and increases health and wealth and is beautiful. But when families don't work well, they can be really catastrophically dangerous and miserable places to be. And I think when we think about the, you know, what living alone means, we oftentimes compare living alone or being single to living in the, you know, Leave It to Beaver, you know, TV show, or to some, you know, to the perfect family and not to the real family. And you know, what I loved about doing this book and doing these interviews is just listening to people talk about how they deal with what's real. And I think there's a lot of surprises for me, a lot of things that were counterintuitive, things that I didn't expect. You know, and I did not come to this as an advocate. You know, I came to this as someone who wanted to understand. And like when I do TV or radio interviews, people still can't get over this. Like, don't you really, you know, believe that this is better, or how can you believe that this is better, or do you fantasize sometimes about, you know, having a place of your own? But that's another matter. But because I do have this experience, like I drop my kids off at school in the morning, and now the parents in my kids' classes know that I wrote this book, and they'll often say to me, like, boy, you know, it would be really nice to have some more space and some solitude. It gets to your first question, you know, about our relation, the need that we have for time alone, because the truth is that, you know, if you're married, if you have children, you don't lose this fundamental need that you talked about in the beginning, to have some space for, you know, reflection and for solitude and for thinking about how your life could be better. So you don't need to live alone to do that, but if you live alone, you know, you get that.
That seems like a great note to end on.
Okay.
There are books available in the back. I'm sure Eric's happy to sign them.
Thank you.